ChatGPT can do Bavarian dialect, ChatGPT can do Swiss German. That really is fascinating.
Compared to conventional chatbots, you actually don't even notice anymore that it's a voice AI chatbot. Instead, you think you're talking to a human.
Then the daughter's voice was imitated by AI, and she called the parents and tried to extort money from them. Personally, I believe that it is limitless. A warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers to a new episode of Digital.Decoded. Today, Mario, we have a truly wonderful topic, in my opinion, namely AI voice AI, which is here to stay. Mario, you recently wrote about this exciting topic in your newsletter, and I think today we'll take a look at it from various perspectives. That means what has changed technically in recent months and years, but also what is actually different, what risks does it ultimately entail, which industries is it transforming, and what is the real impact on our business. I'm really looking forward to this episode, Mario. Thank you as well, and a warm welcome to you too. Fresh back from vacation. I'm curious about our discussion, Mario.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the discussion as well, dear André, as always. Fresher in this case, as you said, but the topics remain the same. The topic of voice AI was extremely present during my vacation. Paloa received a Series C investment of 120 million. For those who don't know Paloa, you can't really call it a startup anymore. It's now a unicorn from Berlin. An absolute pioneer in the field of voice AI, but of course there are others as well. Cognigy is an important provider, as is Microsoft, of course. ServiceNow is doing a lot in this area right now, and so is Salesforce. So there are a lot of big players, of course, but also hidden champions. And especially the topic of voice AI, as you said, is something that's extremely exciting.
But Mario, that's already something, Paloa, 120 million Series C, now belongs to the exclusive circle of unicorns. So unicorns, for our listeners and viewers, are companies that are valued at over 1 billion. That's already a very exclusive group. And in my view, it shows just how much potential there is in the whole topic of voice AI, right?
Yes, Gartner says or has published a study that by 2029, 80% of the volume in customer service will be handled completely automatically via voice AI. And if you think about it today, how many service centers there are, and of course, how many agents, the potential for savings and synergies is obviously significant. And of course, this also affects other areas. Last week, I was at a symposium where I gave a talk on AI, also at Springer in Frankfurt. And there, these topics were also discussed, such as in sales, for example, preparing for conversations and following up on conversations. There are just so many use cases for this.
Absolutely. And what I'm noticing, and this also goes back to Paloa and the other companies you mentioned, is that voice is kind of becoming the new touch. Could you say that the voice is ultimately becoming the new interface between humans and machines or computers? Would you go that far?
I would actually go even further, to be perfectly honest. I believe that in the future, and by the way, this is also a vision that Paloa has strongly pursued, that this voice-to-voice interface will be the new interface of the future. Because today we still integrate many systems via APIs, but voices are, on the one hand, absolutely individual and therefore not easy to imitate, even though there are, of course, examples of that as well. We'll definitely talk more about that later. But on the other hand, of course, you can also connect one voice bot with another voice bot, essentially as an interface. And I believe that will be the future.
Yes, and there are also a few examples from the past, Mario. We still see this in some call centers today. Press 1 or say 1 if you want this or that. Or my favorite example is the navigation systems in somewhat older cars. If you try to enter your destination using voice control, you can sometimes get completely lost. From your perspective, what has changed in the last few months or years? Take Alexa as an example, or even Siri, at least before the big update, was also very, very limited. What do you think has changed there?
I think speech recognition has gotten much, much better. So let's stick with the car example. I got a new car in December. It's basically the same car I had before, just a different color. And especially this speech recognition. Previously, when I used the voice recognition to enter a destination, like you mentioned, André, it would give me some random results. I'd say it worked about 80% of the time, and 20% of the time it didn't. When I do the same thing now in the new model, I actually get a result in, I'd say, 95 to 99% of cases, and it's accurate too. That means the speech recognition is much, much better. And if we look at chatbots now, for example, which are often powered by voice AI compared to traditional chatbots, you actually can't even tell anymore that it's a voice AI chatbot. You think you're talking to a real person. So that means the interaction is much, much better, and the recognition is also much, much better. And it's even gotten to the point where we sometimes discuss with customers whether we need to actively display that you're talking to a machine. That's how far we've come.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. I also played around with ChatGPT a bit recently, and, I live in Bavaria, and on top of that, in Lower Bavaria. And even though I've lived here for 20 years, I still have trouble with the dialect. Audi is always making fun of me because I try to speak Bavarian every now and then. So I did a test to see if ChatGPT could teach me a bit of the Bavarian dialect. And I have to say, it's really amazing. I tried it. ChatGPT can do Bavarian dialect. ChatGPT can do Swiss German. It's truly fascinating what kinds of variations you can get today based on large language models.
Yeah, it's incredible what's possible now. We should also talk about use cases again. I think this is something that affects a lot of people now. I believe there are use cases that are relatively simple, but of course there are also limitations. I just mentioned the example with the chatbot, and there it's sometimes the case that when you communicate in a certain language, you naturally also face challenges. For example, if you're talking about this in German, we had a case like that with a retailer. It was about situations where a customer calls and wants to pick out a Spanish wine. That's when things naturally get tricky and difficult. But I believe these are also issues that in 3, 4, or 5 years, maybe even sooner, maybe in just 2 years, will be a thing of the past.
I think so too, because the development, as we already discussed in one of our previous episodes, is really progressing at such a rapid pace. We're now at 10 trillion parameters with the latest large language models. And that's honestly pretty fascinating. But now you've talked about limitations and we've discussed the possibilities. There are also risks, Mario. I recently read a newspaper article again where a daughter's voice was imitated using AI, and she called her parents and tried to extort money from them. We're talking about deep fakes, not just in images anymore, but also in speech and videos. How do you see this development?
Yes. It's definitely concerning. And nowadays, you can really only recognize it by asking special questions like, what was the name of your first dog? Or this or that. But of course, in everyday situations, you don't even think about that. And I really believe that with all the possibilities that voice AI brings, and as you mentioned, deep fakes, for those who might not be familiar, that also really involves images as well. That means basically both of us in an image and then properly dubbed over. All of that is possible nowadays, and it's really very, very difficult to detect, even for experts, and I'd say it's almost impossible for the average person.
Yes, I see it the same way. And as you said, I think we need different approaches to really verify the authenticity, the genuineness of the voice or the person we're interacting with, because with technical means or just by listening, that's hardly possible anymore. I'd actually like to touch on 2 other things. We've already talked about use cases. How do you think voice can change or even positively influence the entire customer journey to some extent?
Overall, I think it will be positive because no matter what field I'm working in, if we focus on the customer in the context of the customer journey, of course. You mentioned earlier the typical situation in the past. I used to have so many rental cars, and then I always had to go through those number menus you have to type in through all those loops. And then I entered I'm not going to name the company, my customer number for the car rental company. And eventually I got through to an agent. And the first thing they asked was, could you please give me your customer number? And so it was completely useless. And in that sense, I think this is a positive development because on the one hand, I can make these things simpler for the customer, but also, for example, voice recognition. Of course, in the future, I could also do authentication via voice or could do so with all the risks we've just discussed. Of course, that's also tricky, no question. But I think that in many, many cases, whether it's in customer interactions by a salesperson, for example, it will become easier. And that's a typical case. We discussed this recently with an insurance company. A field agent is driving in the car on the way to a customer and wants to get some information from the back office. Today, he talks to a person, which ties up capacity, but in the future, a machine can do that, and even much better.
Yes, that's true. So that means the sales process is definitely being optimized to some extent. For example, the tasks where we humans always had to put in a lot of effort, like documenting something, or take the call center example. I have to call somewhere, type in something complicated. Maybe I don't have my glasses on. That's an issue for me, and then it gets difficult. Then I can talk to the other side, and it really gets recognized there with pretty high accuracy. That naturally simplifies the entire process, but also the interaction itself. You just mentioned the example of field sales staff. That's important to highlight again because I recently had a few discussions on LinkedIn about this. Can AI replace coaching? Well, of course, the topic is much bigger than just the voice, but I'll put forward the thesis that you really can't easily imitate genuine emotions in interpersonal relationships. That is when two people are talking to each other. What's your take on that?
Yes, I would agree with you today, but I think it will be different in the future. AI is constantly getting better. The avatars are constantly improving as well. And we actually discussed this case in another episode, that robots are already being used in elder care today and are even accepted by older people as communication partners. And of course, the question is, how much emotion do you really need, right? Even in coaching. Some things are a bit more matter of fact, to put it bluntly. And do you even need emotional intelligence for that? Maybe these are things, if you look at the whole package, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, who knows how much will still remain with humans. But other things can definitely be taken over by voice AI, by your avatar. And I find that really exciting because today we still have limitations. So you have certain working hours, I have certain working hours, and the need for coaching often arises at a very specific time, right? That means maybe you're just not available at that moment. So it might actually be cool if an avatar could take over,
Yes, that's definitely a big topic, Mario. Maybe something for another episode. I agree with you on that. Yes? I mean, I also wrote an article on LinkedIn about this, and it's about how wherever there is potential for optimization that's identified and ultimately advised. I believe technology can help with that today because it can integrate the various methodologies, recipes, and approaches well and provide you with a recommendation that's personally tailored to you. I'm already on board with that. But whenever it comes to, understanding relationship dynamics, resonance, so much of that happens on an unconscious level. I believe that even in the future, technology, or in this case, AI, won't really be able to help with that. But I find the topic so fascinating. I think we should really tackle this in one of the next episodes to discuss these topics and to have a good controversial discussion about them. Yeah. Because I think there are different perspectives on this, and there are various developments we can address.
I have a point, since you mentioned controversy, because I'm interested in the following. I was recently with a client, and they're active in the car dealership business, right? And they also use a voice AI. I'm not going to say which one. And they saw so much potential in it. They ran pilot projects in the individual branches. It's a larger dealership. And then they ran this pilot at individual locations, and it was so successful that they said, basically, we could just fire everyone at the service counter, to put it bluntly. As is always the case in management, things get exaggerated right away. And yeah, I do see that as problematic, because at the end of the day, it's not just a question of whether you talk to someone, but also how do you feel as a customer, right? Do you actually want to talk to an avatar these days? Well, I don't really know. Sometimes I do, to be honest, but I'd have to say not always, not every single time,
Yeah, I think that's really very much dependent on each individual's personality, I'd say. You mentioned the topic of caregiving earlier, and honestly, that makes me tense up completely when I think about it, that one day I'll be at an age where I really depend on help, and then there's no human being there anymore, but a machine, a robot, or whatever. It just makes me feel uneasy. At this point, I just can't imagine that. Maybe I'll see it differently later on. Maybe the generation that's growing up now will see it differently too. But I think from my perspective, it really depends a lot on personal, how should I put it, preferences, yes, and also on what you actually need at the end of the day. However, I also believe, to be completely honest, and this is like the example with coaching, I can imagine something similar in the field of care. Of course, you can answer questions, you can provide numbers, data, facts, analyses, but everywhere that human relationships take place, whether it's resonance, empathy, or even a heated discussion at the end of the day where emotions are put on the table, I believe that's where our humanity plays a major role. And honestly, I would find it a shame if we left this humanity to a machine or even tried to do so.
But I'd like to take a counter position here because there are two things, and maybe this brings us into different categories. So let's take the example of coaching, which you brought up, André. The first thing is not everyone can afford coaching today. That means if we now say that voice AI can cover certain types of coaching, you can, of course, offer it with a completely different pricing model than you do today or than I do when I coach, right? I think that's the first point. And the second thing from my perspective is that this differentiation might also create a different quality in coaching. Exactly. And first of all, it naturally helps you as a coach as well with preparation and so on. So certain things that a coach might still do today, let's say gathering information like what is your motivation for wanting to be coached and so on. In the future, you might be able to have an avatar handle that for you, and then you can focus on the value-adding topics because that's always an issue in sales as well. These days, I have to do so much admin work, even with my team, that you hardly ever get to the value-adding topics. And I see a huge opportunity there.
All right, Mark, and I totally agree with you on that. I think in this area, just like in many others, the value will shift upwards to some extent, or rather the access will change. And I think that's a really, really important point you made. The access to such services, which isn't exactly cheap, yes, the access to such services will become easier. Yes. And there will be a difference between, let me put it a bit casually, basic services, in this case, coaching and higher quality coaching, when you really need the human resonance, the empathy of a person at the end of the day. I absolutely agree with you on that.
It's almost like flying, really. You have economy plus, business, and first class, right? And first class is then the personal coaching, dear André.
I find that comparison a bit tricky because there's always a hierarchy implied in it. But yes, I know exactly what you mean. Mario, I'd like to briefly talk with you about industries as we wrap up. So the topic is voice AI. We said, hey, in the customer journey, the entire sales process, things will become simpler, they will change. It will also become easier for the customer because, for example, they can call around the clock, talk to someone, and address their concerns, like insurance or whatever it may be. Do you think there are any limits when it comes to industries, or does this affect all industries?
That is something the future will show. Personally, I believe it's limitless. Of course, depending on the use cases, there are always things that work better or worse. But when I look at my own experience with voice AI in discussions with customers, new use cases keep coming up, ones that even I, as an expert, would never have thought of. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. So especially when you engage with these topics, when you learn what these systems are capable of today, what they can't do yet, and what we might be able to achieve in the future, you naturally come up with completely different models. Take this example with the voice interface. I found that really impressive. That was a vision from a CTO once. Palor, who isn't there anymore, he moved on. But I thought the vision was amazing. He said, well, if I have, for example, a change of address, a customer journey, today I have to call someone and let them know, like, hey, look, my address has changed, or I even have to do it in writing, which is even worse. And in the future, the voice bot will simply go through your phone and say, okay, where is this information stored? And then it automatically calls, ideally, probably another voice bot on the other side, and says, look, André has a new address now. Please update it. And of course, you can always back this up with thresholds as well. And that's where I think it gets interesting. These are huge possibilities. But as I said, what happens if mistakes occur? Who is actually liable for all these things? And what if, for example, my life insurance is suddenly transferred to a different address? I think it won't be so much the technology that will concern us, but rather the whole range of governance issues and, of course, security topics.
No question, absolutely. What would you say, Mario, if there's a customer, regardless of the industry, who says, hey, voice, AI could make things easier for my business processes, no matter the area, service, sales, whatever. It could bring increased efficiency. What would you suggest doing with such a customer? How should they get started?
We usually do it like this. We hold so-called ideation workshops. That's the modern buzzword for it these days. You sit down together, just like in the past, hold a workshop or meeting, and simply go through ideas. And usually the experts can quickly tell whether something is easy or difficult to implement with voice AI or AI in general. And then out of a list of 100 suggestions, you narrow it down to the top 5, so to speak. So just like in the old days, what are the costs? What are the benefits? And then, of course, you can identify which use cases offer the greatest benefit, the lowest costs, and can be implemented the fastest. And accordingly, you proceed with a proof of concept and can quickly see whether it works or not. We have actually implemented such processes for clients with a very high level of market maturity within 4 to 6 weeks. That is 30 working days. So that's possible nowadays, and it already achieves a very high level of maturity and doesn't take long. In terms of costs, it's more manageable. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands or even millions here. These are amounts that are affordable.
Yes, I really like what you're saying, and that's also my observation, especially when we talk about AI projects, bringing people together and really discussing what the biggest challenges are that we face in our daily processes. To some extent, of course, it's also about prioritizing and aligning things. Okay, what kind of impact are we actually creating here? What might the costs be to actually implement this, and then also to try things out, to do proof of concepts and learn from them? And in my experience, the proof of concept can be something very small, a very limited use case, just to give the team the opportunity to see this works, this benefits me, this benefits our customers. And then based on that, to continue developing and, if necessary, to make mistakes along the way. I think that's absolutely the more sensible approach.
There's one thing that's always close to my heart, André. That point is to really encourage medium-sized and smaller companies to make use of AI. How often do we both hear this from medium-sized or smaller companies? I can't find any people. People are leaving more and more, or it's so difficult to find anyone at all. Mistakes happen because there are so few people and so much work to do and so on. I believe that especially in small and medium-sized companies, there's enormous potential for AI, because in the past you had to spend months or even years training all those chatbots and similar tools. All of that is no longer necessary thanks to the new models. There are predefined models now, so I can really get started quickly and efficiently, and the efficiency gains become apparent within just a few weeks.
Mario, I think that's a wonderful closing statement. So let me sum it up. Voice AI is truly here to stay. There are a wide variety of use cases practically in every industry and every technology. The most important thing is to get started, to bring people along, to focus on where the biggest challenges are, and to approach the topic through proof of concept. It is independent of company size. Especially in medium-sized businesses, it can really bring significant advantages and, for example, also address the issue of skilled labor shortages in that area. So to me, as they say in modern German, it sounds like a no-brainer, especially when it comes to sales and customer service, to approach this.
Maybe there's one more point I'd like to add, André. Don't ignore the topic of risks. Keep them on your radar and take them into account. I think that's very important, because it would be wrong to completely ignore risks. They exist, but these are all risks that can be managed.
Absolutely important. Thank you for mentioning that again. And don't forget the human aspect. Not everything can be done by machines. There are still people involved. Mario, thank you very much. I also want to thank our listeners and viewers. Please subscribe to our channels on the various platforms. We'd love to get your feedback. Recently, it worked well on LinkedIn when someone said, "I have another topic. Could you cover that?" We take all of that on board. We will also be inviting guests. We are very much looking forward to the journey with you, and thank you very much for watching and listening. We're looking forward to the next episode. Mario and I thank you very much for the engaging discussion. And with that, I would say stay human. Stay human.